Okay, since there's a pause in the action here, we'll get going here. It's May 5th. Welcome back. May 5th, on this date in 1260 A.D., 1260, Kublai Khan became the ruler of the Mongol Empire. Kublai Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan. Is that? There you go. All right. We are on a roll here today. Okay. But yeah, that was on this date in 1260. In 1795, the British government passed a tax on hair powder. It was 1 guinea a year. And putting the tax, the economic lesson here is that hair powder quickly went out of style. And people stopped, yes, because people didn't want to pay the tax to pay for the hair powder. So that was, there's your lesson there, In 1806, James Ireland died. James Ireland died in Virginia. The only thing I like better than a persecuted Anabaptist is a persecuted Baptist. And James Ireland was someone who had spent 6 months in jail in Virginia as a Baptist preacher for not having a license. And keep in mind, this was the Virginia Congregationalists, i.e. Protestants, doing this. I also get a kick out of pointing out when the Protestants are putting the Protestants in jail and the Protestants are killing the Protestants kind of thing. So we don't think it's only the Catholics that kill the Protestants or vice versa. But in 1816, on this date, the American Bible Society was formed. This was there was a British Bible Society, and then there was the American Bible Society. And the American Bible Society is still around. They are still in the business of providing Bibles. They are also in the business of creating translations. They're best known, two of their best known, there's a few, the two of their best known, is the Good News translation. Good News for Modern Man, if you remember that. And the other one is currently they are responsible for the Contemporary English version. It's called the CEV version of the Bible. I think I've got one. I have a CEV. I have not. In 1865 in Bend, Oregon, today was the first U.S. train robbery. I believe they filmed it, and it became a big hit movie. No, I'm just kidding. But the first U.S. train robbery was on this date in Bend, Oregon. In 1910, Alexander McLaren died. Alexander McLaren in Edinburgh, Scotland, was well known for being a nonconformist preacher. Okay, so a nonconformist preacher in England. And he wrote a commentary, and if you go on, if you Google, Bible commentary on something, there's a certain commentaries that were very well known 100 years ago, like Matthew Henry's commentary that you can find in the public domain, and McLaren's is one of them. But a nonconformist preacher was pretty much anyone who was a Protestant non-Anglican in England, because the Anglican Church was the state church of England. But if you were a Protestant and not Anglican, you were considered nonconformist, a nonconformist preacher. And so he died on this date. Here's the other name you might recognize. Okay, it was on this date in 1925 that John T. Scopes was arrested in Dayton, Tennessee. He's arrested in Dayton, Tennessee. What was his crime? Does anybody remember?
He taught evolution.
He taught evolution in the school. Yes. He was paid to teach evolution in the school. No, I'm serious. The Civil Liberties Union at the time paid him like $100 and said, we'll take care of your legal, we'll take care of all of that. We just need you to teach evolution in the school. And he said, sure, why not? And he was arrested and was convicted. I mean, he did break the law, and William Jennings Bryan did win the case. And I think it's the Goodman Theater. One of the big theaters downtown is in this next year is going to be doing Inherit the Wind, which is the fictional play based on the Scopes trial. And finally, today is my childhood friend's Richard Frederick's birthday. He was born on this date on May 5th, 1961. And I remember that because, one, he's my childhood friend. Two, I just recently got back in touch with him. He sent me a picture of me from 1969. I'm like, whoa, man, was I a handsome kid. No, I'm just kidding. But I also remember that because it's also the day that Alan Shepard became the first American in space. So just something about, I just remember, well, I mean, I remember weird things if you haven't noticed that already. I want to finish 2 Corinthians. Believe it or not, I do. So you got to get started in order to do that. So we're in 2 Corinthians 10 today. And if the last 4 chapters of 2 Corinthians, and again, I've mentioned this before, that one of the very contemporary views of looking at 2 Corinthians is as a group of letters as opposed to simply a letter, or letters written in stages. It's a letter written in stages. I mean, I'm like, the more I think about it, the more I like the letters written in stages idea. But if anybody's going to split it anywhere, it's going to be at chapter 10. Okay, so the last 4 chapters. So like anyone who's on that modernist side is going to say, 10 through 13 is a separate letter. Still by Paul, it's just a separate, they just put it together and called it this collection of letters, which may be true. We don't really know. I like to think of it as being a letter in 3 stages, although I'm not against it. So we start out talking about how to look at 2 Corinthians 10:13. One way to look at it is as a second letter. Okay, so some other time Paul wrote 10 through 13. And the reason you'll see as we get through talking about this particular text, we'll see that Paul is back into the defense of his ministry stuff. Okay, I was like, wait, I thought we were done with that. I thought we had settled all of that. Why are we back onto that topic? Kind of thing. So it's like, well, if it's a separate letter, that makes sense. Maybe it was this was a letter to one person in Corinth, or one church at Corinth, Achaia, which is the geographic region, and 1 through 8 was a different, could be. Or you could look at it as the third part of a 3-part letter, which I kind of like, and that is that chapters 1 through 6 are dealing with the past problem, and then chapters 7 and 8 are the present. 7, 8, and 9, I should say, are the present. Okay, that's 7 is that where he gets the message back from Titus, and then 8 and 9 we talked about last week with the offering, and 10 through 13 are the future. Okay, so in the future, let's remember this. Okay, so again, it's like, okay, this was the problem, then he got the solution. Okay, now in the future, this is the third part. So 10 through 13 are, all right, now from this point on, this is how we're going to deal with it. Okay, so that we don't have these problems again. Okay, so that's how I'm looking at it. I'm looking at this 10 through 13 is Paul talking about the future, meaning not future like Revelation future, but just, okay, you know how it is, you have your kids and they did something wrong, and so you have to deal with the issue, deal with the solution. Okay, now how are we going to make sure this doesn't happen again? We're dealing with the future. Okay, that sort of end. Because again, I like the idea of looking at Paul as the father of an adult child, trying to fix things, and okay, how are we going to make sure this doesn't happen again? Okay, so Paul appeals here in verse 10. So the first verse, by the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you, I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold when you are away. So Paul is appealing to the church plural. Okay, that you is second person plural. Okay, I'm appealing to you all. Okay, by the humility and gentleness of Christ. Okay, these are his credentials, or this is what he's backing himself up with. The humility and gentleness of Christ. And this is something where, depending on your translation, those 2 words are translated quite a different ways, quite a lot of different ways. Who has humility and gentleness? Who has a different translation?
I have meekness and gentleness.
Meekness and gentleness?
I have gentleness and kindness.
Gentleness and kindness. Okay, so these are words that are used in different ways throughout. But again, in fact, and so now I'm going to bring in another one, and this is from the Net Bible, and that is that the alternative translation is leniency and clemency, that the words can also be used in that sense. Okay? And it kind of fits in with the authoritarian sense of this particular message. Again, Paul's back into this authority, his apostolic position. And it also contrasts with Paul's description of himself being timid. Okay? So, by the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you, I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you. Now, the NIV puts quotation marks around that, around timid and bold. Okay, so again, this is those quotation marks are not in the original text. Okay, that doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just that's a decision that the translators made in looking at the sense, looking at the passage. Okay, so does anybody have a text where it's not there are not quotation marks there? Okay, which one do you have?
NASB.
Okay, so it isn't always, and the point is, because Paul is going to go on talking about his writing and why he writes the way he is and how he is the way he is. And again, this is something, again, he says he wants to be harsh in the letter. Remember in chapters 1 through 6, I want to be harsh in the letter so I don't have to be when I'm in front of you. I want to get this out of the way. It's like, have you ever had a situation where you think, okay, this is going to be an awkward conversation, and you think, you know what, maybe I'll just send a nasty email and that'll fix it. Has anybody ever been tempted? I won't ask if you've done it, but for those of you who have friends who have done it, how often does it work? Okay. Not very often, okay? But Paul is kind of like, okay, I'm trying to do this, and this is kind of an accusation that we're going to come back to here as we go through this. Where he says he's timid, he's timid in person, but he's bold in his letters. Now, maybe this is something that Titus came back to him with when Titus came back in chapter 7. He said, "Yeah, they got your letter. They didn't realize you felt so strongly about it because when you were with them, you were so nice or friendly." I don't. That's 100% speculation, but it clearly is something that I think bugs Paul. But we'll talk about one possibility here a little bit later on as far as why Paul is that way in person and a different way when he's writing. Although, it could just be that Paul's a better writer than he is speaker. Have you ever gone to read something by a guy and then you see the person speaking and you're like very underwhelmed by his or her speaking ability? Kind of thing. I once went to see Hunter Thompson. Does anybody know who Hunter Thompson is? I once went to see Hunter Thompson speak live. Okay, it was a weird moment, and so Hunter Thompson is, again, if you know, you know, but he a very colorful writer, very interesting writer in a number of ways. But then when you go see him speak, he just has a really annoying he's passed away now, had a really annoying way of speaking. I'm not even going to try and just Google him. You can see, and you start listening to him for about a minute, I'm done. I don't need to listen to him anymore. But it was just and I'm not comparing Paul to Hunter Thompson by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just his writing style is one thing and his speaking style is something else. But bold you, I beg you that when I come, let me get this down here. I may need to get, my translations now are based more, I think, as I get older on how large the print is. Forget about the translation. A King James with large print is better than the best translation that I can't read. I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. Okay? Now, so Paul is like, I don't want to have to confront you. I don't want to have to be the bad guy because nobody wants to. Well, a few people want to be the bad guy. Okay? I don't want to, even though I know I'm going to have this conflict with some people who don't quite understand, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, how we play the game. Because we're going to get to this point later, okay? Or how we operate, all right? It says, for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. Now here Paul is talking about himself, he's talking about the apostles, and I think in a larger sense he's talking about the Christian movement, the way. Okay, we do not fight, for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. And this is one of the things, if you remember the Corinthians were upset, one of the things they were upset about him was that he didn't take their money. Okay, which, it seems kind of weird, but they were, it was kind of like they were offering, perhaps they looked at it as they were offering hospitality to him, and he refused it. Okay, I mean, if you invited somebody over for dinner, and you laid out a food in front of him or her, and they said, oh, no, thanks, I'm not going to eat. You'd be like, well, wait a minute, we had a pastor once who was notorious for not eating food that was, he was kind of a psycho-lunatic. Well, he still is. But stories were told that he would get up from the table and go into the person's kitchen and find the peanut butter and jelly. Am I making this up? Okay. So,
he's told that himself.
Yeah. Yeah, he was proud of this. So again, psycho-lunatic. But be that as it may, he said, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. Okay? On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Okay? So Paul is reminding, because they didn't like the fact that he didn't take their hospitality. They don't like the fact that he doesn't do this, because the Corinthian church had decided, or people in the Corinthian church decided that, hey, this is the way things are supposed to be done. You're not doing it the way we think it's supposed to be done. Therefore, you must not be one of us. Which I suppose in a very strict sense of the word is true. It's like if you define your group as being only people who are baseball fans, and any New York Mets fan is not allowed, which is a very reasonable criterion. Okay, and if you show up with a New York Mets fan, you go, well, you're not one of us. That's okay. Well, by definition, you are. It's interesting here to me, looking at this particular, as I was reading this particular passage, where Paul is telling us that even though we live in this world, we do not wage war as the world does. Okay, so Paul and I mistake Debbie for the Apostle Paul all the time. It's that authority thing. But my wife, the Apostle, and I watched this movie this past year, a documentary called God and Country. I don't know if anybody's heard of this or not, but it has to do with the rise of Christian nationalism in the U.S. And Christian nationalism is kind of a vague, sort of squishily defined sort of thing, but it has a lot to do with the evangelical role in politics circa 2024, 2015, 2010, starting back as far as the 1970s, kind of figuring out, okay, how did we get to this point where you've got this evangelical, where evangelical in the U.S. means is more of a political party than it is a religious position. How did that happen? What happened in that point? And in that particular, and I was fascinating by this, because to me it's a fascinating topic, but they were talking about the early days. If you guys remember, how many remember Jerry Falwell Sr.? Oh, yeah. Okay, Senior, like Jerry, yeah. It kind of started there, which morphed into the Christian Coalition, which morphed into this, which morphed into that, okay? and you know, there were several different groups, but there was an interview or a speech from the early 1970s. They interviewed a guy, the guy speaking was a guy named Paul Weyrich, who, and I was in the 80s when this was all going on, was when I was in graduate school for history and then went on for political science. So this was all, you know, when you're a political science major, this is your bread and butter, right? So I'm paying really super close attention to this stuff at the time. And in this particular documentary, they give this quotation, or they show the videos. It's Weyrich speaking, and I remember the guy. He was one of those, you know, architects of the. He's the guy who coined the phrase moral majority. That's who he is. Okay, but he in this speech he's talking about something about winning elections, and he says, you know, oh, we don't want. You know, we're not talking about or something. And I'm paraphrasing it. You'll get the point. But he said, we're not talking about democracy. We're not talking about voter turnout. He says we don't really want to emphasize voter turnout because, speaking as a conservative, you know, Republican type, he said, you know, when turnout goes up, we do bad. We do better when turnout is low. Okay, and that's true. And if you know anything about voter turnout, if you separate the U.S. into just Republicans and Democrats, there are like twice as many Democrats, people who identify as Democrats, as identify as Republicans. Okay, that's just a fact. Okay, but the difference is Republicans are like 3 times more likely to vote than a Democrat is. So if there's only a 50%, or you know, if the Democrats only get 20% of their voting to come out, and the Republicans get 80% of their voters to come out, who's going to win the election? Republicans, you know? And he's talking about majority rule, and he says, we never had majority rule. We don't want majority rule. We want, you know, kind of thing. And as I was watching that, I was intrigued with that because it's all correct. I mean, I get that. As far as, you know, it's factually correct. But it's like, that's a fairly sophisticated understanding of the way the electoral process works in the United States. And you know, we bought into that. The Christian movement bought into that. And you know, the more I thought, then as soon as I read this, we do not wage war as the world does. As soon as I thought about that quotation, I thought that's what we're doing. We've decided that we can take advantage of this quirk in our in our electoral system and take over, that we can bring this nation back to God as if it was ever God's to begin with. Okay, and I'll argue that point too. Christians were never the majority. They weren't even the majority on the Mayflower. Okay, there were 150 people on the Mayflower, and only 60 of them signed the Mayflower Compact, or something like that. I don't know the exact numbers. Okay, but still, and don't don't even go into like an African American church and start talking about how America is a Christian nation. I'm just telling you now, don't do it. Okay, but be that, and I thought that's what this is, waging war as the world does. Now there's a tension there. I get it. There's a tension there because we are, I think most of us are U.S. citizens, and we all have a duty to vote, and we have a right to put people in office. I get that. That's fine. Okay, but it's when it becomes this is what God wants you to do. This is your godly duty. This is your spiritual responsibility to do that. And I'm like, you know, Paul is not talking about that. Paul is not talking about here's how we're going to take over the Roman Empire. You know, even though, in a sense, Christianity did 300 years later take over the Roman Empire. 250 years, 312, 373, something like that. Did in a sense take over the Roman Empire. Paul's like, that's not our goal. That's not our goal here. And you're looking at me, judging me, and they're going to get down later, verse 7. You are judging by appearances. Okay? You have this idea of how, you know, and this is what, again, looking to the future, this is how we got into this problem in the first place. Let's fix this so that going forward we don't have any more of these dust-ups, and I don't have to come hammer down, you know, as far as an offering you committed to. Okay? But the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they, that is the weapons we fight with, have divine power to demolish strongholds. Okay? We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Okay, so Paul is talking about the world of ideas. Okay, and the battle we have, and in other passages he talks about we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against power, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. Okay, he's not talking about the Senate majority or the House majority or whatever it is. Okay, you can't really look at these verses and go, oh well, Paul says we need to get out and vote. We need to get out to vote. Yeah, no, you made a leap there. I don't care what translation you're using. Okay, you made although I'd have to check the current version that's out that has a certain president's name on it. I don't have that one. Paul revisits the subject of his accusers who accuse him of being two-faced. I'm getting back. That is where timid and bold. Paul goes on to manage their expectation of what the Christian life really is. We, that is Paul or the church, do not wage war as the world does. We have different weapons. Okay, the weapons of our warfare are not merely human. Okay, so it's like the spiritual weapon is not the ballot box. Again, the ballot box is important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying don't vote. I'm not saying don't do your American duty. But it's like when you start saying, okay, this is my spiritual act of worship. I'm like, I'm thinking you're kind of okay. We demolish arguments and every obstacle. There where it says pretension, and that's the word that I was talking about. That's the word that's only used here in the New Testament. So what is it we're destroying? And Paul picks a Greek word that no one else knows the meaning of. So it's translated a lot of different ways. Obstacle, persuasion, arrogance is another translation for it. All of these things that are focusing are an obstacle to what? To the spread of the gospel. Okay? We take captive every thought to make it obey Christ. And then we will punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. And I think, here where it says, where am I? And we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. There's a couple of different ways to look at that. One way, and I only put one option there, which I shouldn't. You should never only put one. You should always have two. I know that. But to me, he may be talking about looking at the future. So once this offering thing is taken care of, this is how it's going to be in the future. Okay? Because again, it's confusing. To me, one of the things that I really dislike about 2 Corinthians, is Paul's use of the we. It just bugs me. It's like, and it's like, okay, is Paul speaking for himself? Is he speaking for this is one of the interpretive problems of this book. But I think he's talking about the offering. Now, some have looked at this and said, well, your obedience is in trusting Christ, and then once you trust Christ, you're looking at this. I'm like, I don't know. It doesn't really keep with the overall flavor of the book to me. But it's not. I think he's referring to the offering. And he says in verse 7, you are judging by appearances. And an alternative, if you have an NIV, it's got a translator's note at the bottom. It says, look at the obvious facts. Okay, there's another way to put it. Okay, there's a translator's note there. He says you're judging by appearances, and as soon as you're judging by appearances, okay, again, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world. You're not basing your opinions on anything spiritual. You're looking around going, well, they're voting and they're getting their agenda through. Why shouldn't I? Well, as an American, knock yourself out. Go for it. Sign up, become a, poll watcher, run for office. Does anybody here run for office? I did. You ought to do it. It's great fun. Marty, you're retired. You got time. I did. Knocking on doors, vote for me, signs, the whole thing. I lost. 43% of the vote, which is the same percentage that Bill Clinton got when he won the presidency. Just want to point that out. So,
What office were you running for?
Alderman of Oak Forest. It was not a real well thought out idea on my part. The guy who was running for mayor came to my house and he goes, we really need somebody to run for office in this thing. And I go, hey, I'll do it. That was about how much thought I put into it. It was a great experience. Everybody should do it. Everybody should run for office. If you really want to see how, even that small thing, just running for like 2 neighborhoods was really all that I was. You learn an awful lot, way more than you'll ever what politicians have to deal with. It's like you go from one, I know this is off the topic, but you go to one door and say, the guy would say to me, well, you never see the cops around this neighborhood. That's what, if I would really think could change, you never see the police in this neighborhood. And you go to the next door and the next guy would say, you know what I like about this neighborhood is you always see the police around. So that was the one thing. And then I was in Oak Forest, and I would go to a house, and I would get the line, like every other house, it seemed. Every other house. I'm not a racist. So this person's telling me, I'm not a racist, but there are a lot of people here are. And they don't like what's going on, because there were, Markham was over there, and there's African-American population in Markham. I'm not a racist. And you go 2 houses down and go, I'm not a racist, but, there are a lot of people here who are. You go to 2 doors down, I'm not a racist, but there are a lot of people, Which made me think that the houses where they didn't tell me was where the racists live, or maybe there was just one racist in the whole town and everybody knew him. I don't know, but it was like, seriously, not, and then you'd have to go, there's absolutely nothing I can do about that. It violates so many laws to fix that problem. It's too bad. Maybe that's why I lost. I don't know. Maybe I should have come in and said, well, I am, and I'm going to, I don't know. I'm going to edit this part out of the video kind of thing. You are judging by appearances because not all Christ followers look alike. Not all Christ followers follow the same rules. There's certain things we assume, and I've been caught in that many times. The classic time was when Debbie and I first moved we were both living in Oak Forest. We first visited this church, and we sat behind a guy who had very long hair. Okay, he would have been in his 40s at the time, which at that time was like super old. Okay, he was ancient. He was in his 40s. But he had long graying hair, literally to his waist, all right, to his waist? In a ponytail, to his waist. Now, if you have grown up in the fundamentalist church, fundamental Baptist church that I have, and you see a guy with hair that long, is your first thought, this man really loves God? Not quite. Not a bit. I'm sitting back there looking at the back, because again, he's right in front of me, and the preacher's up there, and all I can see is this guy's ponytail through the whole thing. And every once in a while, I'm there judging by appearances, right? I'm like, this guy must be the unsaved husband. That was my first guess. It was the unsaved husband there, or somebody's neighbor that finally invited to go to church, kind of thing. And then this. No, he wasn't. He wasn't a pastor. The service ended, and the guy turned around, and he and his wife invited us over to their house for ice cream. And we went over to his house, and they were just turned out to be a wonderful Christian couple, somebody who came out of the Jesus People movement, which of course, coming out of the fundamental Baptists, that's no. But it's like, wait, the who, the what, kind of thing. A wonderful, wonderful guy. But it was just like, it was such a earth-changing kind of perspective. Because again, I sat through, and I won't ask, you can ask Debbie what she was thinking, but I was back there thinking unsaved husband. Nice guy, making his wife happy, going to church. you know, and a guy who loved the Lord, great guy, you know, been a believer, was very active in the church, wonderful, wonderful guy. Never cut his hair, you know, but so I'm. He could be, yeah, could be. But not all Christ followers look alike. So in 10:7, where am I here? So even if anyone is you are judging by appearances. If anyone is confident that they belong to Christ, they should consider again that we belong to Christ just as much as they do. So these people who are in the church and saying, listen, that we're in judgment on Paul because he wasn't doing what they thought he should do, he's like, hey, I'm just as much a believer as this person is. So even if I boast somewhat freely about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up rather than tearing you down, I will not be ashamed by it. So Paul isn't going to apologize for his position or what he said in any of those letters. I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you with my letters, for some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive and his speaking amounts to nothing. Such people should realize that what we are in our letters when we are absent, we will be in our actions when we are present. Okay. Paul is being accused of being forceful in writing but unimpressive in person. Now, sometimes this is you know later on in this book we'll hear about Paul's thorn in the flesh, and of course we don't know what Paul's thorn in the flesh is. Okay. You know, like sometimes you know what someone's thorn in the flesh is. Debbie's thorn in the flesh is me. Okay? But it's like, what was Paul's thorn in the flesh? And a couple of ideas. One of them is that he had bad eyesight. Because in one of his books he says, you know, see what large hand I write with, or something like that. And he was always using an amanuensis. Is that how you pronounce the word? Not quite a ghostwriter, but he speaks and the person writes it down. Kind of thing. But others have suggested that Paul spoke with a speech impediment. That there was something about his speaking that he couldn't, you know, that it's had a speech impediment. And one of the arguments for that is this description of Paul when he's in person. And so he's like, okay, I can't, because of a speech impediment, again, this is absolutely 100% speculation. Okay. Well, maybe it's like 98% speculation, because you do have this here, all right? So they say, you know, and so because of that, because he knew that in person he couldn't be that kind of a bold, dynamic preacher, or, you know, that forthright, that he needed to do it in writing. Could be, just an idea kind of thing. He says, such people should realize that what we are in our letters, when we are absent, we will be in our actions when we are present. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. Okay? So again, Paul's comparison is with Christ. And what has God done in their life? Now, we were out last night with a friend of mine, and we were talking about, this guy is a runner. And we were talking about running groups. I don't know if anybody's ever been in a running group. But one of the things about running groups is they're a very kind bunch. Okay? It's like, you know, the 40,000 people who are lining up for the marathon or the Shamrock Shuffle or anything like that. They're all a very kind bunch. Meaning that if you're having trouble on a run, somebody will stop and help you. You can bet on it. Okay? They just will. That's just how they are. And everybody there is competitive in the sense that they want to beat their best record, but they're really indifferent as far as what you get. I mean, they want you to do your best as well. And if your best is faster than their best, well, good for you, kind of thing. And it's like it's the only group I've ever been in, a part of, that is that selfless. Everyone else is like kind of like, you know, what am I getting out of this sort of thing, you know? And I think when Paul is talking about here is, you know, you're looking around yourselves and you see what you're doing and you see what your brother is doing and you think, okay, I'm pretty good. Paul's like, that's not a wise way to do it. So, you know, to just compare yourselves with each other, you know, whereas like with the runner, it's like, what's my personal best? How can I improve that? How can I be better? And I think even better is to look at Christ and say, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Okay. We, however, will not boast beyond proper limits, but will confine our boasting to the sphere of service God himself has assigned to us, a sphere that also includes you. Now, I've mentioned this point before, but Paul's sign of his authority to him, what his argument, his sign of his apostolic office is the church. You know I'm legit because you're there because of me. This church exists because of me. Okay, so again, it's I don't know. I should know. I don't know the name of the first pastor of this church. Does anybody know the name of the first pastor of this church? I should know that. But be that as it may, it'd be like, how do we know that guy was doing a good work? Well, he started this church. The church I grew up with was started by a guy named Jack Sellards. Okay, he came in, and now the church is 300 people and big lot, doing well, kind of thing. But he says, this is my sphere of service. This is what God has given me is what I'm going to boast about. Okay. We are not going too far in our boasting, as would be the case if we had not come to you, for we did get as far as you with the gospel of Christ. Okay, so if I hadn't started the church, I'd have nothing to boast for with you. Okay. Themselves with others. Paul's boasting, the sphere of service includes the church of Corinth. Neither do we go beyond our limits by boasting of work done by others. Do you remember in 1 Corinthians 5 where Paul says, Paul watered, Paul planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase? Paul's like, I'm not going to take credit for work that other people did. If I'm taking credit for it, it's because I'm responsible for it. And again, let's get this straight, so going forward, we don't have these problems. Okay? But let the one who boast in the Lord, for it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. Okay? Again, this is kind of like Paul's way of saying, you serve the Lord your way and I'll serve the Lord his, kind of thing. Okay? Finally, Paul's strategic goal is to move beyond the church of Corinth, let me back up here. Paul also won't take credit for the work of others. And again, compare that in 1 Corinthians 3, 5 through 7. That's where Paul planted the seed, Apollos watered, that passage. Our hope is that, this is going back to verse 15, our hope is that as your faith continues to grow, our sphere of activity among you will greatly expand. Okay, and so again, Paul is looking for this church to expand, for his ministry to expand, I think to move the gospel beyond Corinth. Maybe at this point he's thinking about going to Rome. He's thinking about how to spread the gospel further than that. Okay. Finally, it is not self-commendation that matters as much as being commended by the Lord. Okay, and Paul is looking, he says, your very existence is my commendation from the Lord. Okay, so these other people that are in the church, what are they, these people that were in opposition to me, they don't have to show what I have to show. Okay. Paul is going to get a little more specific next week. Well, actually, it's in verse 11. We're going to talk about it next week. When we talk about Paul's hope you will put up with me in a little foolishness. I should, that's what I should title these classes now, a little foolishness, from something along that line. Any questions? All right. And again, who died on this date? No, I'm just kidding. It is going to be on your test. All right, thank you very much. You're welcome to go.